We have the Gloomhaven 2nd edition, the Frosthaven 2nd printing, as well as miniatures for any Gloomhaven content that you want miniatures for, as well as a brand new Gloomhaven RPG. And I'm just going to come out and say that this one is my own personal pick of the week. Just to be clear, I am not a huge fanboy of the game Gloomhaven. I haven't really played it. I'm not really interested in playing it, but I think what they're offering here is really impressive, and I think the RPG actually looks really, really exciting. And this might even be a bit of a controversial opinion, but the 2nd edition also plays a big part in why this one is my own personal pick of the week. And I'll go into explaining that all in a second here, but if you're not familiar with Gloomhaven, this is a cooperative adventure where players are each going to have their own character as well as their own deck of cards. Players are going to be working together, completing different scenarios as they explore the worlds of Gloomhaven, trying to complete their own specific goals, but then also trying to defeat the evil that is growing within the world. Whenever players jump into a dungeon, they're going to be setting up the board according to that specific scenario, and then the game's going to be played over a series of rounds. At the start of each round, each player is going to be choosing 2 cards from their available deck in order to play on that round. One's going to be acting as your main action, and one will be acting as your secondary action. And what I mean by that is that each of these cards are actually dual use, with a more powerful primary action and a less powerful secondary action. But from the 2 cards that you chose, you're going to be choosing one primary action from one of those cards, and then the secondary action from the other. But that's not all, because the cards that you pick are also going to dictate which order you get to perform your action relative to the other players, as well as the enemies, because the enemies are going to have an initiative value, but then the cards that you pick also have an initiative value on them as well. And then when all the players reveal their cards, the order of activation is going to be dictated by those initiative values. And the different actions available to you will allow you to do all sorts of different types of movement, attacks, or special abilities. Some of these actions can also have some different elemental effects, allowing players to either build up or spend some elemental tokens in order to perform that action. Any cards that you play will be discarded at the end of your turn, which means that you can get them back later by performing a rest action, but some of the cards might have a special icon on them indicating that instead of discarding them, you're actually going to be burning them for the rest of the scenario. Anytime that a player performs an attack action, it's normally going to allow them to draw from the attack modifier deck. This can have all sorts of effects, but it's normally going to be adding or removing damage from your attack. Defeated enemies do drop loot, which you can pick up by going onto that specific hex, or also by using a loot card, which will allow you to pick up any loot within a certain distance. Of course, like I said, each character activates in their initiative order, which means that you might be getting attacked by enemies before you have a chance to defeat them. And a player is defeated if they ever run out of health, but the nice thing here is that you can discard some of your cards in order to avoid damage, but you'll also be defeated if you ever run out of cards. And the game continues like this over a ton of different scenarios as players explore the world and discover many of its secrets. And this does have some legacy elements like tuck boxes or putting stickers onto the main map as you discover different towns and points of interest, but it's nothing that will prevent you from playing the game for a second time if you have the time for it. If you already own the 1st edition of Gloomhaven, I don't think you need to rush out and buy the 2nd edition. All the changes here are pretty minor, but I did say at the start of the video that one of the reasons that this is my pick of the week is because of the work they did on the 2nd edition. But I don't think the changes here are going to make it a way better or a way different game. It's just that when you're making even minor tweaks to such a massive game, there is an attention to detail and overhead that requires quite a lot of work, and I just think they did a really great job of it. The main things here are just typo fixes, clarifications to avoid different loopholes or dead-end scenarios, and they did also make some changes to the physical components in terms of their presentation, or they're just minor changes to the strength of the component because they did swap out the stands for slightly better ones, and they are offering a slightly more reinforced box because this is quite a large game, and storing all of that in a box can be quite a strain. The most significant changes that they made that might affect the gameplay are also still pretty minor. They made some small tweaks to some of the characters just to balance out their relative power, and then basically they just did a similar thing to some of the enemies and bosses just to make them feel a little bit less unfair or annoying for some of the bosses that felt that way. If you're interested in Frosthaven, there is going to be a 2nd printing here, so you will be able to get your hands on it, but this is exactly the same as the previous release of Frosthaven. There's no changes here, and this is the same edition. But of course, the thing that everyone's been asking for is the miniatures. The original game just offered miniatures for your main characters, but everything else was offered with standees. They're going to be offering a lineup of miniatures for everything previously released, so whether you own Gloomhaven, Frosthaven, Forgotten Circles, or Jaws of the Lion, there's going to be miniatures to replace all the standees as well as the tokens for enemies, bosses, and summoned creatures. And in case you're wondering, this is over 500 miniatures in total. And then finally, we have the RPG. And like I said, this is another reason this is my own personal pick of the week. And the reason for that is that a big part of why Gloomhaven is such a success is because of the quality of the campaign that it offers. But it does come with a lot of overhead and fiddliness because this is not an easy game to get to the table. Offering an RPG is a great alternative to experience the worlds of Gloomhaven without having to have a whole lot of setup or teardown. And you can just jump into the game with a lot more freedom and start experiencing the story that the game has to offer. But that's not the only thing that I think makes this RPG so cool, because there is something about it that I think is going to make it stand out from a lot of other RPGs. And that's that in this one, you're actually still going to be maintaining that card management. I don't know exactly how it's going to work, but they do mention that this is cross-compatible with every previously released game. So I think those action cards might come into play when it comes to performing your actions in the actual RPG. I can imagine that this could work out really well because traditionally in RPGs, you are limited to the amount of spells and abilities that you can perform, and using these cards in a similar way that they are used in the actual board game is a great way to incorporate that. Other than that, you can also use the components and miniatures to augment your RPG experience, but this is going to be playing quite a bit differently than the board game, even if you do share some of the components. Using those components is completely optional, and another big change here is that in the board game, your class and your race were tightly coupled together, but in the RPG, you'll actually be able to mix and match whatever you want, so you can actually have any set of skills with any of the benefits that come with a specific race. I love RPGs, but I just rarely find the time to be consistent with them, so I'm definitely more of a board gamer. But when it comes to the case of Gloomhaven, I think the RPG might actually be a lower overhead than the board game. So if the fiddliness and the expansiveness of the board game was intimidating, the RPG might be a better choice, and I think it's what I would go for in this scenario. Of course, there is also the digital app as well, but it's just not going to be at the same level socially as either the board game or the RPG. So it's nice that we have all these different options, but in the end, it's up to you to weigh the pros and cons depending on what you're interested in, and if you're interested in any of these. If so, you can check out the campaign. I got links in the description below.